Portland, Oregon, the city of roses, with a population of 650,000 within city limits and a metro population of 2.5 million. It is the largest metropolitan area in Oregon and the 23rd largest metro area in the United States. Portland is located in the Pacific Northwest region of the US and Canada, often referred to as Cascadia. The city lies 60 miles east of the Pacific coast on top of a dormant volcanic field called the Boring Lava Field, named after the village of Boring, which, fun fact, is sister cities with Dulles, Scotland. Portland is situated on the northern end of the Willamette River in the Willamette Valley, which is home to about 70% of Oregon's population, and the Columbia River that separates Oregon from Washington is just a few miles north of the city. Portland has a warm summer Mediterranean climate with cool and rainy winters and warm and dry summers. The winters are typically overcast, while the city does get some snow as well. Portland has 3 major league sports teams, the most famous one being the Portland Trail Blazers of the NBA, with an NBA championship in 1977. The other major league sports teams are the Portland Timbers of the MLS, with 1 MLS Cup from 2015, and the Portland Thorns of the National Women's Soccer League, with 3 NWSL championships. Other sports teams in Portland include minor league teams like the Winterhawks of the Western Hockey League and the creatively named Portland Timbers too. Interestingly, the city also briefly hosted an ice hockey team in the 1910s and 20s called the Portland Rosebuds, who made it to the 1916 Stanley Cup Finals, where they lost to Montreal Canadiens, making them one of only 2 cities who have been to the Stanley Cup Finals but don't currently have an NHL team. Famous Portlanders include The Simpsons creator Matt Groening, musician Courtney Love, and NFL defensive tackle Ndamukong Suh. If you didn't already know, this is the 3rd part of a 4-part series where we will be visiting interesting locations all around the western United States and Canada. If you haven't seen the previous 2 episodes about Seattle, Washington and Vancouver, British Columbia, I recommend you check those out from the link in the description. This video will be divided into 2 main parts. First, I will talk about the history of Portland, after which I want to share my experience visiting the city and exploring some of the interesting sights it has to offer. I'll include timestamps, so feel free to skip around. Starting with the history of the city. The area that would become Portland was inhabited by 2 bands of Upper Chinookan peoples, the Multnomah and the Clackamas peoples. It's important to note that the Chinooks are a completely separate group from the Coast Salish people from Seattle and Vancouver. The Multnomah and Clackamas traded with each other along the Columbia River, gathered berries, and hunted in the area for thousands of years. Unfortunately, however, like in the rest of the Americas, diseases like smallpox and malaria carried by Europeans arriving on the continent led to the decimation of the populations of these 2 groups. Spanish Basque explorer Bruno de Zeta was the first European to discover the mouth of the Columbia River during his expedition of the Pacific Northwest in 1775. He tried to explore the river, but eventually had to turn back due to its strong currents. In 1792, a private American ship called the Columbia Rediviva had better success. Captain Robert Gray from Boston, Massachusetts and his crew became the first non-indigenous people to enter the river, which was later named after the ship. The first Europeans to arrive in the Portland area was the crew of the British naval officer William Robert Broughton, who were tasked with exploring the Columbia River as part of the Vancouver expedition. The crew reached as far as the eastern part of the current Multnomah County, claiming the land for the British Crown and naming the nearby mountain Mount Hood after the admiral of the British fleet. Today, there's a plaque commemorating the point farthest inland reached by the crew. A decade later, the American expedition to explore the western United States after the Louisiana Purchase, called the Lewis and Clark Expedition, visited the Willamette Valley in 1805. In subsequent decades, the river was used by fur trading companies as a key transportation route. Fort Vancouver was established as a fur trading post just across the Columbia River from modern-day Portland by the British-Canadian Hudson's Bay Company in 1825, as the British believed that the then Oregon country, which wasn't fully controlled by either the United States or the British Empire, would eventually be divided by the Columbia River, with the British getting the northern part. However, eventually they realized that they might have been wrong about that and decided to build another fort 2 years later just south of the Fraser River. 4 years later, a new settlement was established also by the Hudson's Bay Company, this time at the Willamette Falls, which could be used to run a lumber mill, and this settlement was named Oregon City. Later in the 1840s, it became the final stop for pioneers looking to file land claims in the Oregon country, on the route that became known as the Oregon Trail. Many of the pioneers who came to Oregon City settled on the popular trading route between Oregon City and Fort Vancouver, and to build their houses, they of course needed to cut down trees, which they often did in this area, which became known as the clearing. The particular section of the Willamette adjacent to the clearing was also deep enough for a larger ocean-going vessel, as noted by Massachusetts sea captain and pioneer John Couch in 1840. In 1841, a pioneer from Tennessee by the name of William Overton arrived in the Oregon country, possibly by way of California, and began working at the Methodist mission at the Dalles on the Columbia River. A year later, in 1842, an attorney from Massachusetts by the name of Asa Lovejoy came to the Oregon country over the Oregon Trail. He settled at the Whitman Mission in what is now eastern Washington state, although a year later he returned back to east with Marcus Whitman, the founder of the mission, and then came back to the Oregon country as part of the Great Migration of 1843, when around 1,000 settlers traversed the Oregon Trail, making him one of the few people who actually did the Oregon Trail twice. And upon his return, he set up a law practice in Oregon City. But what does this have to do with Portland, you may ask? Well, later in 1843, Overton saw potential in the land at the clearing and began considering making a land claim. He, however, lacked the funds to do so and had to find a partner for his settlement. He went to talk to Lovejoy, who he had met during a boat trip from Fort Vancouver to Oregon City, and eventually managed to persuade him to share half of the land claim in exchange for paying the claim fee of 25 cents, which is difficult to translate to today's money, but it was about a quarter of the average American's daily wage, which is still cheap, and is the reason so many decided to make the dangerous trek over the Oregon Trail. The two men then set about clearing trees and building a settlement on their claim. Later that year, however, Overton decided to sell his share to someone else. I couldn't find a clear reason as to why, but some sources seem to think that he was just kinda bored. There's not a whole lot we know about the guy. We don't even know what he looked like. He originally tried to sell his claim to a cooper in Oregon City called James Stevens. The two men already had a business partnership, as Stevens bought wood from Overton in order to make his barrels. However, Stevens rejected the offer as he was preparing to make a bid for a different land claim, which ended up becoming the city of East Portland. Overton then went to a store owner and fur trader called Francis Pettigrove, who agreed to buy the share for $50. Now, this was a lot of money at the time. However, Overton owed $60 to Lovejoy, so he didn't really make any money. In 1844, he left for Texas, perhaps because he was told his mother, who was living there, had become ill. After this, though, we don't really know what happened to him. Some people think he was hanged in Texas, and some say he might have moved to Hawaii. Regardless, he didn't return to Oregon again. Back at the clearing, strongly encouraged by the sea captain John Couch, Lovejoy and Pettigrove decided to build a town on the claim, with platting of the town beginning in 1845. As co-owners, both Lovejoy and Pettigrove wanted to rename the clearing, but couldn't come to an agreement on the name. Both wanted to name the town in honor of their hometowns, with Lovejoy being from Boston, Massachusetts, and Pettigrove from Portland, Maine, respectively. They decided to choose the name based on a best-of-3 coin toss. Now, you might notice, this is how children decide who gets to play with the Legos next, but apparently this is also how Americans decide what their cities are called. Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out who won the coin toss in the end. America was like this close to having 2 Bostons. Well, I mean, America does have 16 Bostons, but the other ones have like a max 1,000 people and look like this. The penny used for the coin toss, now called the Portland penny, is now on display at the Oregon Historical Society Museum in Portland. With its new name, the two men began work on their new town, clearing debris and trees from the site, and Portland quickly grew into a small settlement. Pettigrove built a small log store and hired a couple to run it. He also commissioned a wharf to be built for the town. But just like Overton a few years before, Lovejoy decided to sell his share of the land later in 1845. He had been elected to the provisional legislature of the Oregon country in 1844 and as the mayor of Oregon City in 1845, so he didn't really have time for the town anymore. He sold his share to the New York-based merchant and Pettigrove's business partner, Benjamin Stark, and from this point he focused on his political career, which was pretty successful as he served as speaker for both the provisional legislature of the Oregon country and the Oregon Territory House of Representatives. After an attack on the Whitman mission, the place where Lovejoy worked after his arrival in Oregon, and the killing of 13 missionaries, including Lovejoy's old boss Marcus Whitman, Lovejoy served in the army as an administrative general in the resulting Cayuse War. After the war, he stayed in California for 6 weeks during the California Gold Rush, after which he continued to serve as a legislator until 1857, when he helped draft the Oregon Constitution that later became the Constitution of the state of Oregon. After this, he retired from politics and spent the rest of his years investing in businesses in Portland and briefly serving on the Portland Public Schools Board from 1868 to 1871. Lovejoy died in 1882 at the age of 74 and was buried in Portland. Both him and his original partner, William Overton, have streets named after them just a few blocks from each other. How cute. In turn, the Portland native Matt Groening named the Simpsons character Reverend Lovejoy after the street. Bet you didn't see that coming. The man who Lovejoy sold his share to, Benjamin Stark, along with his new partner Francis Pettigrove, then proceeded to become full-on capitalists, first establishing a triangle trade between Portland, San Francisco, and Honolulu, using Stark's connections and Pettigrove's warehouses. For a short time, they even controlled much of the trade in and out of Oregon. They built wagon roads from Portland to Oregon City and the agricultural Tualatin Plains to the west, and to increase cattle profits, Pettigrove opened a slaughterhouse by the river and began selling hides to Daniel H. Lonsdale, who had just opened the first tannery primary in Portland. Pettygrove and Stark drove many others in the area out of business by monopolizing trade between Portland and Hawaii. However, all good anti-competition fun comes to an end at some point, and after an apparent disagreement with Pettygrove in 1847, Stark temporarily returned to New England, leaving Pettygrove with full control of the town site. By 1848, Pettygrove was one of the wealthiest residents in the Oregon Territory. During the same year, gold was found in California, sparking the California Gold Rush. Stark, all the way in New England, got wind of this and decided to sail for California. He spent the following 2 years working as a merchant there, and in 1849 he got wind of another piece of news, this time from Portland, and it was that his business partner had left and he didn't own his share of the land anymore. See, this is why people have trust issues. What had happened was that when the gold rush began in 1848, it started attracting so many people out of Oregon that there was a labor shortage. So when Pettygrove realized that there was little hope for further short-term growth in Portland, he decided to start selling all his assets. And when I say his assets, I mean the entire site, including Stark's share, because he was on the other side of the continent, so what was he gonna do about it? He sold the site to the tanner Lonsdale for $5,000 worth of leather, or a 9,900% profit from his original investment of $50. Although it's a little less impressive when you take into account that he pretty much stole half of it from his business partner. In 1851, Pettygrove, along with some new business partners, decided to found a new city called Port Townsend on the Puget Sound, just northwest of what would become Seattle. There he spent the rest of his days until his death in 1887. For all these years, he had kept the Portland penny in his possession, which was then later gifted to the Oregon Historical Society, possibly by one of his descendants. And in the 1960s, when the city built 2 new parks to commemorate the 2 founders of the city, Lovejoy and Pettygrove, the same coin was flipped to decide which park got which name. How cute. But now, with the third owner of the city out of the picture, seriously, why does everyone have such bad commitment issues? Lonsdale split the land with 2 other investors, Stephen Coffin and William Chapman, the latter of whom also co-founded the newspaper The Oregonian. Stark, who rightfully felt a little cheated by this ordeal, demanded that Lonsdale came to California to negotiate on the land claim. And in 1850, Lonsdale arrived in San Francisco to have a meeting with Stark, reaching an agreement that Stark would receive the northern part of the land and some money for the land sales. Stark returned to Portland with Captain John Couch, who also filed the land claim just north of Portland in 1850. And finally, after the land being resold 5 times, 1 backstabbing, and 1 guy disappearing from the face of the earth, these 5 guys became the owners of the city that is now Portland. And by this time, Portland had already grown into the largest settlement in the Pacific Northwest with over 800 people, which doesn't sound like a lot, but at this time the Pacific Northwest was mostly populated by trees and beavers. And like many frontier towns, most were men, while around 20% were female. The town had a steam sawmill, trading houses, hotels, and its own newspaper, as mentioned before. However, it was still very much a frontier town, with humans and animals walking around its mud roads, and the site was filled with tree stumps, with outsiders often nicknaming it Stump Town. But regardless, on February 8th, 1851, the town was officially incorporated. During the first couple decades after its incorporation, Portland experienced steady growth thanks to its lumber industry and easy access to the Tualatin Valley. Additionally, Portland was already a major port city in the Northwest, so much so that in 1851 it was the departure point for a certain ship that was carrying a group of pioneers to settle at Alki Point on the Puget Sound. Portland Public Schools was founded after the incorporation in 1851, and the town's first firefighting service was also established with the Volunteer Pioneer Fire Engine Company, which was reinforced in 1854 when the city council voted to establish the Portland Fire Department. In 1860, the city's population had grown to nearly 2,900, and by 1870, it was over 8,000. The city benefited from the large number of settlers moving into the new state of Oregon, which itself had grown in population 7-fold since 1850. In 1870, around 9% of the state's population lived in Portland. Rapid growth during the 1860s brought a lot of construction to the city as well. For example, the Pioneer Courthouse, the oldest federal building in the Pacific Northwest, was finished in 1869. Nice. Portland continued this growth into the 1870s, with the city opening its first public park in 1871, just west of the downtown, and the street railway horse car service in 1872. The development then came to a sudden stop in 1873, as, just like in Seattle and Vancouver at this time, a major fire swept through downtown, destroying 22 blocks and causing $1.3 million in damage. And that's in 1873 money. Today that amount would be nearly $34 million. One of the only buildings that survived the fire was the Northrop and Blossom Fitch building, say that 5 times fast, which is still up today. But if the city's luck wasn't poor enough, the rebuilding of the city was then delayed due to the 1873 financial crisis, making all the 1873 New Year's posts itch like milk. The economy slowly recovered and in 1878 was in full swing. Despite the fire and the later economic crisis, Portland managed to more than double its population in the 1870s. On the downside though, by the late 1800s, Portland had lost its reputation as a sober frontier town and garnered a reputation as a hard-edged, gritty, and dirty city. The Oregonian, which was based in Portland, mind you, even called the city the most filthy city in the northern states due to the unsanitary sewers and gutters. Some have compared Portland to the early history of New England, a home for desperate people trying to find a new life at the end of the world, away from the well-established elites of the East. By the end of the 1800s, it was considered one of the most dangerous port cities in the world. The city was filled with saloons, brothels, and gambling dens, populated by masses of sailors passing through the port. Population-wise, Portland finally managed to make it to the top 100 cities in the 1890 United States Census, placing as the 61st largest city in the country. This was also the first time the city had more people than the city it was named after, Portland, Maine, and at this point was still the largest city in what used to be the Oregon country, slightly beating out Seattle. However, in 1893, Portland lost some of its maritime trade to the deepwater port in Seattle due to it getting connected to the rest of the continent by rail, despite Portland itself being connected to the eastern states by 3 different railroads. Despite this setback, the city kept growing steadily in the 1890s, mostly through merging with other towns in the area. In 1891, Portland merged with the nearby Albina and East Portland. This was followed by the annexation of the nearby Selwood 2 years later. Many of the city's most iconic buildings, such as the City Hall and the Union Station, were built during the 1890s as well. By the 1900 US Census, Portland had nearly doubled its population and was still the biggest city in the region. Portland was then selected to host the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition that was to take place in 1905. The exposition wasn't officially regarded as a World Expo, but as it featured exhibits from 21 countries and attracted over 1 million visitors from the US and worldwide, it is often informally regarded as one. For the city, the exposition was a massive boost, not only economically due to the influx of visitors, but also by increasing the worldwide reputation of the city. The festivities also excited many of the city's elites, with Portland Mayor Harry Lane being remembered for giving a rousing speech at the exposition about establishing a festival for roses in the city. The city had planted thousands of rose bushes around the fairgrounds in preparation for the exposition, and by the end of it, the city's residents had become quite fond of them. Mayor Lane believed he could attract a steady flow of visitors with an annual festival, boosting the city's economy and image. And next year, in 1906, the first Rose Festival and Flower Parade was held in the city. The event was such a success that a year later, the Portland Rose Festival Association was incorporated, and the first Portland Carnival was held the same summer. The carnival gradually became known as the Portland Rose Festival and has been a staple of the city's culture ever since, gaining it the nickname City of Roses. The city's newfound fame had a profound impact, as it contributed to the city's growth from just over 90,000 residents in 1900 to 207,000 in 1910, having over 30% of the state's population. By this time, however, the city had lost its status as the largest in the Pacific Northwest, as Seattle overtook it by about 30,000 people, with Seattle remaining the largest in the region to this day. Now, going into the 1910s, much of downtown Portland was flooded by the Willamette River in 1911, although luckily it didn't seem to do too much damage. The city kept growing despite the small setback, and many of the city's iconic bridges, like the Broadway, Steel, and Hawthorne bridges, were opened during this decade. The Portland Rosebuds also had their first stint in the city in the 1910s, being established in 1914, reaching and losing the Stanley Cup Finals in 1916, and then eventually being disbanded in 1918. In 1915, the city expanded with the merging with Linden and St. John's, which didn't significantly grow the city's population, but added a lot more land to the city. This was during the time before the US officially joined World War I in Europe. Harry Lane, now a US senator from Oregon, was one of only 6 senators to vote against the declaration of war. Regardless, the declaration passed and the United States entered the war on April 6, 1917. In Portland, both the city's elites and poor workers hoped to gain something from the war, with the elites eyeing new investment opportunities and the workers hoping for new employment opportunities and a boost to the local labor movement through an influx of workers. Much like in Seattle, the war boosted the city's shipbuilding industry, growing the workforce from around 4,000 at the beginning of the 1910s to over 30,000 in 1917. According to the Oregonian, over 7,600 Portlanders had volunteered to fight within 2 months of the declaration of war. The war would last 1.5 years, after which Portlanders would have to endure the 1918 influenza pandemic sweeping through the city, but there was going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. Before the war, Portland's economy had mainly focused on shipping goods through its port and less on manufacturing, making it sensitive to fluctuations in international trade. The manufacturing boom caused by the First World War had a decisive impact on the city's economy, as even though the shipbuilding industry declined after the war, the city's lumber exports increased 5-fold in the period from 1919 to 1926, making Portland the largest manufacturer of lumber among all the cities in the world. During the boom, the Portland Rosebuds were also re-established in 1925, playing in the Western Hockey League. However, the league folded after the team's first year and the team was disbanded again, with the players being sold to Chicago to form the Chicago Blackhawks. By 1930, the city's population had grown to over 300,000, with Portland being the 25th largest city in the country. Much like in in Seattle and Vancouver, the Great Depression after the 1929 stock market crash saw an emboldened labor movement in the city. In 1934, 1.3 thousand members of the International Longshoremen's Association working at the port participated in the West Coast waterfront strike, which shut down shipping in every port along the West Coast, including in Seattle, as mentioned in the Seattle episode. The protests often turned violent, which shook the city for a better part of the year 1934. In October, an arbitration decision was finally achieved, making a compromise between the workers and the employees' demands. Portland continued to suffer from the Great Depression for the rest of the 1930s. The city government tried to revive the economy through public works like the construction of the Portland International Airport. In 1940, things changed, however, when the demand for military material exploded due to Great Britain's increased preparation for war and the expansion of the US Navy. A year later, in 1941, American businessman Henry J. Kaiser received federal contracts to build cargo and escort ships for the US government and chose Portland as the site to build 2 shipyards for the task. He hired over 100,000 workers for these shipyards, which played a major role in the growth of the Portland metropolitan area, which gained over 200,000 new residents between 1940 and 1950 to reach 760,000 residents, making Portland the 22nd largest metro in the United States, the highest it ever got on the list. Just like in Seattle, the steep rise in jobs attracted a large number of African Americans from the South during the Second Great Migration, quadrupling the African American population of the city. However, the city experienced increasing tensions between the newcomers and the white settlers, as well as between the newcomers and the old African American population. Besides the African American population, Portland had also built a sizable Japantown in the area what is now Old Town. However, in 1942, during a wave of paranoia throughout the west coast of the United States and Canada, following the Japanese Empire's attack on Pearl Harbor, Portlanders of Japanese descent were transported to the Portland Assembly Center in the location that is now the Portland Expo Center to be sent further inland to internment camps. Most of the Japanese residents complied with the authorities in an attempt to prove their loyalty. However, the few who returned out of the thousands that left found that the once bustling Japantown was no more. Today, the Japanese-American Historical Plaza by the Willamette River commemorates the location where the Japantown once stood. During the war, an underground network of organized crime had established itself in Portland. This continued well past the ending of the war, and in the 1950s, the city once again became infamous worldwide for its criminal activity. But despite this, the city kept a steady rate of growth during the post-war years. The city opened more of its iconic bridges, like the Fremont, Morrison, and Mark I bridges during this time, cementing itself as the Bridge City, another popular nickname for Portland. The emerging hippie culture in San Francisco during the 1960s inspired a similar movement in Portland. The Crystal Ballroom became a hub for the psychedelic subculture in the city, while elsewhere in the city food cooperatives and listener-funded radio stations were established. A large social activist movement started taking root in the city at this time, which started championing environmental causes and Native American and gay rights in the city. By 1970, the rapidly growing Portland had established itself as a progressive city, with its metro area reaching 1 million residents for the first time. The Portland Trail Blazers were established this year, with it only taking them 7 years to reach their first, and so far only, NBA championship. The Portland Timbers also had a brief 7-year stint in the MLS's predecessor league, from its establishment in 1975 to its dissolvement in 1982. The 1990s saw an emerging technology industry in the city, with companies such as Intel moving to the Portland metro area in what people sometimes call the Silicon Forest. And although not really a technology company, Nike also moved its world headquarters to Beaverton in the Portland metro area, opening its first retail store called Nike Town in Portland in 1990. All of these massive companies moving to the Portland area of course had a profound impact on the city's economy. By the late 1990s, Portland was the 4th most expensive place in the US to buy a home. Regardless, the city saw explosive growth in the early 2000s, growing by over 300,000 to reach over 2.2 million residents in the metro area by 2010. The Portland Timbers were also re-established in 2009 to join the MLS, with the Portland Thorns following in 2012. Both have become quite successful teams, which has gained the city yet another nickname, the Soccer City. In the early 2000s, Portland became known for its unique culture and attractiveness to young people. Keep Portland Weird quickly became the unofficial motto of the city, and weird might be an understatement. Among others, the city is home to the Unipiper, who does whatever this is. I just wanted you to know that this is a real thing that happens in the world. Economically speaking, Portland was second only to Louisville, Kentucky in attracting and retaining the highest number of college-educated people in the US between 2001 and 2012. As the city's numerous nicknames go, the city council made City of Roses or Rose City the official nickname of the city in 2003. Bridgetown and Stumptown also remain popular, and especially PDX, from the airport code for Portland International Airport, has become a part of everyday speech. Today, Portland is known for its art scene, with its independent galleries and alternative innovative art spaces. It is considered one of the most liberal and progressive cities in the country, with a large counterculture scene. The city's weird and quirky culture is well known throughout the US, with some people even using Portland as a general term for anything weird or quirky. The city is also considered one of, if not the most bike-friendly cities in America, with over 400 miles of biking trails, and one of the most environmentally friendly cities as well. Oh, and Stalin's granddaughter runs a bookshop in the city. That is so Portland. On the negative side, the city has for a while suffered from a homelessness epidemic, with the city having the 12th largest homeless population in the country as of 2024, at around 6,000 to 7,000 homeless, or 9.9 per 1,000 residents. Additionally, a fentanyl crisis has rocked the city in recent years, with the city's leaders declaring a 90-day state of emergency in downtown Portland in January 2024. Although similar to Seattle and Vancouver in many aspects, with its founding as a faraway frontier town and its reliance on the lumber and shipping industries for much of its history, the story of Portland has been one of the more interesting ones of this series so far in my opinion, with its mysterious founder disappearing from history books, its other founders turning into anti-competition monocle-wearing monopoly man supercapitalists, despite the city later turning into one of the most left-leaning cities in the whole country, and with the whole city being named based on a coin flip. The weirdness and the quirkiness of the city isn't just a funny 21st century phenomenon, it's in its DNA. But now that we know the history of the city, I want to share my experience visiting and exploring it. My first stop was Seattle because, well, I trust you understand how things being between other things works. There I had about an hour in the International District before my next bus would leave, and after an hour of wandering aimlessly around the district, I returned to the Seattle Flixbus terminal. Or in other words, this random parking lot next to a Japanese supermarket. There, not to my surprise, the bus was late. It wasn't a big deal though, it was probably only gonna be like 15 minutes. So after the first hour of waiting, I realized the company had a tracker for the bus, and I was happy to learn that the bus had reached Mercer Island and was only an 8-minute drive away. So 8 minutes later, it was still in the same spot. And at that point I learned that the vice president was visiting the city, and the road had been closed off, leaving the bus stuck in place for about 2 hours. Regardless, after 2 hours, my bus had finally arrived. And after a 4-hour bus ride through the scenic Cascadia, the bus then arrived in Portland in the early evening. I wasn't really filming at this point, I just wanted to get to my hostel. The bus arrived at the Portland Union Station, from where I started walking down the Northwest 6th Avenue, the Old Town neighborhood. The city's homelessness and drug problems were very apparent, with tents and people clearly high on something filling the streets. I made my way out of Old Town to West Burnside Street, where I took a bus to my hostel for some much needed rest. As my hostel was on the east side of the city, I started my exploration there, in the Buckman neighborhood of the city. This neighborhood used to be a part of the city of East Portland before it was merged with the head honcho Real Deal Portland. It's a nice, charming suburb full of pretty houses, quiet streets, and horribly kept football pitches. Walking down the street, I'm sorry, this is the worst camera work I've ever seen. I promise I'll never do this again. My destination was Hawthorne Street, known for its local boutiques and lively atmosphere. Eventually I made my way there, casually doing the worst camera work known to mankind. The street was as advertised, not quite Bourbon Street in New Orleans, but a nice little street populated by charming bookstores, cafes, bars, restaurants, and a movie theater. Next I wanted to go check out downtown Portland, and to get there I had to walk back to my hostel, from where I could catch a bus over the river. It's alright though, on my way I spotted this mural of Spider-Man, this basketball court they decided to put on a parking lot, and this picture of Nicolas Cage. Because why not? I finally made it onto the bus, which took me over the Burnside Bridge to Portland's downtown. I got off on Morrison Street in the heart of the city, where the city had been founded 179 years ago. The first stop I wanted to go check out was the Pioneer Courthouse Square. Opened in 1984 and often called Portland's living room for its popularity with the locals. The square is creatively named for the Pioneer Courthouse that sits next to it. Unfortunately, the square was under renovation when I was there, but this is what it usually looks like. Downtown Portland itself is characterized by high-rises that are a mix of early 20th century and more modern architectural styles. The streets are filled with all kinds of murals and other artworks, and generally the area just has a really nice vibe. Next I wanted to walk to the famous Pearl District of the city, the former industrial neighborhood now known for its restaurants, breweries, and art galleries. The neighborhood was quite the walk away from the square, but I got to see more of the city on the way. Not this again. After walking through the Old Town Chinatown again, I finally made it to the Pearl District. Just like advertised, the district is full of modern apartment buildings, small boutique shops, parks, cafes, and restaurants. And after getting a $10 milkshake, I just kind of wandered around in the scorching hot weather. Yeah, I forgot to mention, the day I was there just happened to be the second hottest day in the city last year, at around 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And as the genius I am, I forgot to pack shorts for my trip, so I was strolling around in my black jeans. As for the district, it's a very charming area, clean and not too busy, but after spending $10 on a milkshake, I wasn't too interested in buying anything else, so I headed back towards downtown to check out the riverfront. On my way, I stumbled upon more of the city's many public artworks, like, whatever this is. On Google Maps, it's just called the pod, which doesn't really help to be honest. Apparently, you're supposed to push the little ball in the middle to make it wiggle. There was also this, for which I couldn't even find a name, so I'm just gonna have to assume this is an homage to Super Mario. An example of more classic public artwork would be this traditional Chinese gateway, erected in 1986 that sits at the entrance of the Chinatown district. But at last, I made my way to the riverfront, where I could get a good view of the Willamette River, as well as the many bridges from which Bridgetown gets its nickname. But this is gonna wrap up our tour of the city. Overall, the downtown Pearl District and East Bank areas were peaceful and nice areas to visit. There's a lot of restaurants, cafes, breweries, and boutiques to visit. The price level, at least in the places I went to, is quite steep, just as a warning. There aren't many huge or famous monuments or attractions like in Seattle and Vancouver, but I still enjoyed my visit. The Old Town Chinatown district, at least a year ago when I visited, was unfortunately in quite a bad shape, with the city's homelessness and drug issues very apparent in the area. However, I've heard the city is trying to overhaul their responses to these issues. I would recommend this city, especially the modern art lovers, as there's definitely no shortage of different public artworks, murals, or art galleries here. As for me, I returned to my hostel where I would catch a bus the next morning to the Portland International Airport and get on a flight to the last location in this series. But that's gonna wrap up this episode on the history and the city of Portland, Oregon. I really hope you enjoyed it. This was the third part of a 4-part series across the western United States and Canada. Next week, we're gonna take a flight somewhere very different. However, if you're interested in seeing that episode already, it's available right now on my Patreon. My patrons, regardless of the membership fee, will get every episode of this series and all future series a week early on Patreon. Additionally, my Patreon producers will have their names shown on the screen at the end of videos. If this interests you, there's a link in the description. See you next week.